Thanks so much for listening to No Lions Here with me, Big Panda. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to No Lions Here. My name is Big Panda, and I'm a recovering sex addict. On today's show, get ready to be inspired as we welcome the incredible Erin, a natural-born entrepreneur and healer with a journey that's nothing short of extraordinary. Picture this. At the age of 12, Erin kickstarted her own tutoring business, uncovering the transformative power of encouragement in teaching. Despite academic triumphs, she faced personal battles, including overcoming addiction and navigating through life's challenges. Fast forward to her early 20s, Erin took a leap to pursue a neuroscience doctorate at Vanderbilt. However, a profound spiritual awakening led her to a path far beyond the confines of scientific studies. In 2015, Erin co-founded a coaching company, playing a pivotal role in its growth. Yet a spiritual calling once again beckoned in 2019, steering her towards new horizons. Since then, she's been deeply involved in clinical outreach and business development, culminating in the creation of Inner Ray Coaching in 2022. Today, Erin's journey includes coaching, leading workshops and retreats, and co-hosting a podcast where she generously shares her wisdom. Erin's qualifications read like a powerhouse resume: a bachelor's in neuroscience and chemistry, a master's in neuroscience, and a certified professional coach. Trained in various therapeutic practices, Erin's story is one of resilience, triumph over addiction, and conquering complex challenges. Get ready to be enlightened and uplifted as Erin shares her insights with us today on the show. Erin, thank you so much, and welcome to No Lions Here.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, what a kind and generous introduction. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you on. So my introduction to Inner Ray was through Begin Again Institute. They gave us a anatomy of a workshop, a workshop, anatomy of a relationship workshop. I think that was earlier this year.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I really looked forward to it every single week. I think it was a four part series that we zoomed in on, and it I learned a lot from it, and took a lot away from it that I still share with people today and try to incorporate into my life and my recovery. So we're definitely gonna jump into that here in a little bit, but wanted to open the floor up to you and tell us a little bit how, what led you to doing what you're doing today.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you attended that workshop and it was helpful. So I'm excited that we're going to talk about that today because that's definitely one of my favorite things to delve into. And how I got here, well, I always say to people, you know, when I came into the world, no one gave me a handbook on how to have relationships. And my parents also definitely did not have that handbook, and neither did their parents. In fact, a lot of the handbooks they did have probably should be burned. Um,
I agree.
and, ultimately, what I learned as I got older is there was nothing I wanted more than connection and quality relationships. And actually, there's lots of studies. There's a Harvard happiness study. There's lots of studies showing that people's quality of life is directly correlated to the quality of their relationships. So for me, what my journey looked like was my childhood was very challenging and very dysfunctional. I started drinking and using drugs at like 10 years old. There was just a lot of trauma, alcoholic home, sex addict home. And fast forward, one of my coping mechanisms that was not just drugs and alcohol and numbing was to find safety in academia and in control. So I ended up being a very high achiever in spite of all of the other ways that I was numbing and escaping and dealing with the dysfunction of my home. And a lot of people can't always relate to that because they're like, well, how could becoming a good student and becoming a scientist be one of your coping skills? But if you think about it, all that science really is controlling variables and measuring probable outcomes, which as a trauma survivor, that actually makes a lot of sense to me. So I just went all the way with science. I ended up getting an excellent undergrad degree in neuroscience and chemistry. became a neuroscientist, was getting a doctorate, and somewhere along the way, I ended up getting sober from drugs and alcohol when I was 24. And what started to happen to me, that was like a moment in my journey where things started to kind of split. Because when I was drinking and doing drugs and surviving my childhood, I had these kind of like multiple facades that I would, live through all the time. And when I got sober, I was hearing all about this, like what I would now call the path to recovery was about honesty, integrity, openness, willingness, and ultimately authenticity. Mm. And so what I was hearing about, this is what's going to save your life and this is what's going to keep you sober, was super different from the way I'd been operating in the world. Mm. And every day I would go into my research lab and I was less and less aligned with the culture and the approach to understanding the mysteries in life. Because here I was, I gotten sober because someone told me to like do these 12 steps and, pray and take personal inventory and make amends. And here I was like measuring proteins and trying to understand the intricacies of the dopamine pathway as the path to like helping people heal, and my worlds just kept getting like further and further apart. And also I found that I was a lot more relational than most of my colleagues, and a lot of my skill set came from connecting with people directly. So without getting into the whole journey of what ultimately made me leave my doctorate, I was on a journey after that to be like, how can I figure out how to connect with people and help people learn some of the things that I've been discovering along the way? And I stumbled into someone who considered herself an expert in relationships, and she encouraged me to become a coach. At the time, a lot of people were telling me to become a therapist, but to be honest, I was almost 30 years old. I'd been in school my whole life. In the end, academia ended up being kind of a traumatizing experience for me without going too far into it. Sure. And so becoming a coach made a lot of sense. And after that, it just was about, okay, how are all these various tools? Because what was happening is I was getting like kind of some help in therapy. I was learning a lot from 12 step. I was reading a lot of books, and there just didn't seem to be this like cohesive approach on how to have better relationships. I could read one book on boundaries, or I could read one book on childhood dysfunction. And I kind of synthesized this all together. And again, after many years, lots of mentors, lots of training, Inner Ray was birthed. Because through this whole journey, what I learned is, one, there's no one way. There's no one system that you can just be like, oh, follow A, B, and C, and you will have the relational life you desire. And if anybody tells you that that's true, you're probably signing up for a cult.
Run the other way.
So just FYI. And the other thing I learned is the reason there's no one way is because the answer has to do with going inward and cultivating that authentic, deep connection with self and operating from that place. So there can't be a formula for that because we're all different. And any other system that's based outside of you is going to have so many variables, and ultimately you're going to have to abandon yourself to follow that system. So when we talk about, the anatomy of relationship and the stuff that I've developed and cultivated, it's really important to remember that, again, none of this is designed to self-abandon or to not listen to yourself or not listen to your truth. It's all designed to allow people to pour themselves into it and apply it and express it in a way that feels authentic. So anyway, I hope I answered your first question and didn't go on too many tangents.
No.
But that's how I got here.
No, not at all. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there that can relate to different aspects of your story, like that whole idea of, wanting to find that control in academia, like that does make a lot of sense to me. Now, obviously, I am in active recovery and understand that, these things came out of want for control. Didn't feel like we had the control, or that lack of connection. Like, I didn't realize, obviously until I got into recovery, just how bad I crave like true intimate connection with somebody else, and how bad I really wanted that and for me that kind of came in a form of like I looked at my family and wanted my family to be something different than it was. And I think that a lot of people can relate to that, and I'm a firm believer that our addictions definitely stem from childhood and what happened to us growing up, and how we learned to cope with things, and that these truly were coping mechanisms to try to ensure our survival.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely. Definitely my experience too. And I forgot to kind of name, because of the subject matter of the podcast, I'm also in recovery from, the sex and love addiction category. I'm not a big fan of the term love addiction. I have a whole episode about that if you want to hear why, or we can talk about that. However, ultimately intimacy disorders and all the flavors and branches of that, I fit into being in recovery from that as well.
yeah, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
So in array, so you started in array,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm assuming that it's finding that in array and letting that in array inside of you shine, which I think is beautiful, because the more in recovery I am, the more I uncover and the more I shine. Now, it is really hard for me to see that inside myself. That's why it's so great that we have sponsors and networks and program friends that can point those things out. So I think that's a beautiful name for it. So what in array? What do you guys? What do y'all do there?
Good question. So yeah, I think it's good for me to fully break down. So the Ray in inner Ray is RAE, which is an acronym, and it stands for Radiant Authentic Energy. So
Mm,
exactly like you said, it is about shining your radiant authentic energy into the world. Because when I was trying to figure out a name for my company, um, I'll just be honest, because I'm very spiritual. I actually saw Ray in a vision. It just like came to me one night when I was like kind of in between awake and asleep, and I saw the letters RAE. And initially I thought it meant something else. Like there was probably 6 or 9 months when I first saw that I thought it was like the first letter of a couple of people's names. Like I didn't quite know what it meant. And then I went to England a couple of years ago and did a family constellations retreat. And basically, without telling you my whole journey with that, what I learned from doing that big piece of work that I did there was that it stood for radiant authentic energy. So it's been kind of both a mystical and practical name. And it ended up, just really embodying everything that I believe in. Because most people just want to have good relationships, like I've said. And whenever I tell them, well, actually, it comes from cultivating your inner Ray, people that are really seeking the truth kind of relax when I say that. So, yeah, so that is the foundation of the name. Primarily, we are a coaching company. Within that, you can engage with us as an individual. I also work with couples, families, small groups. I do workshops. I actually just hosted a retreat in Carmel by the Sea in California. We had 7 people come to that, and it was fabulous. I'm trained in a lot of like experiential modalities, so it's a little hard over Zoom sometimes to do that. So I love to be able to get to work with people in person to practice and utilize the way the curriculum can be brought to life when you're in a group setting. Um, so we have coaching curriculum. I also have a podcast that I co-host with Katie Bruzzoni, who is a coach as well. What else do we do? We have a blog. Oh, we have courses, online courses, where if you don't want to engage in a coach one-on-one, you can take one of our courses, and there'll definitely be more to come in the future. So yeah, so we help people transform and improve relationships and develop communication skills. Trying to think what else we do. Did that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You guys got a lot of stuff going on over there. That's awesome. And I know that as a single guy taking that, what I got out of all of, that curriculum that we went through was that inner relationship, that relationship with my inner self, and how I can strengthen that and improve on that, every day. There was a lot of stuff that I took away from that. I think jumping into what I kind of got out of that was, I think the one of the big pieces that we talked about was capacity.
Mm.
And what is my capacity for, a romantic relationship right now? What is my capacity towards work? What is my capacity for these other relationships that I'm in? And I thought that was just so cool. Like, such a way, talk about being honest with yourself. Like, you really have to be honest with yourself when you're sitting here talking about capacity, and truly, what is my capacity? Yeah, that was something that definitely, like, really stood out for me.
Yeah. So what's really cool is originally when I started what has now become Anatomy of Relationship, the only part I had envisioned was the intimacy spectrum. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But basically, it's this idea that most people who struggle with relationships like to be on or off in a relationship, where there's actually a whole spectrum of intimacy. But what I realized because when I first created that, it was, at first I thought it was a relationship spectrum. And then I was like sitting with it one day and I was like, well, it's not really a relationship spectrum, because one relationship could operate in different levels of intimacy at different times of the day, different months of the year. Like, there's all these things that can impact how people are able to show up and connect. And if we don't consider that, we can have high expectations in our relationships.
Mm.
So I kind of backed up a little bit and I was like, okay, so what actually goes into having a relationship? And I came up initially with just commitment and connection. And that came from a conversation with a client where he was really struggling with what we'll call a relational Ponzi scheme. He's a finance guy, so that term worked for him. But he had all these different women that he was like kind of in love with all of them and just kind of doing this whole thing. And his dad actually said to him, he shared this with me in a session, that connection without commitment is chaos. And that really
Mm.
got my brain thinking. And I was like, okay, so to have a good relationship where there's the ability to have intimacy, you have to have commitment and connection, and they have to be balanced and building probably at the same pace. And then I sat with it a lot longer, and that's when capacity came to me. So now I call it the 3 C's of a relationship that allow you to have intimacy. And so what I teach clients is, okay, let's talk about a relationship where maybe, and often when I teach this now, this wasn't true when you took the Anatomy of Relationship course, but I start off by teaching the 4 attachment styles. And I have people pick, okay, where's a relationship where you feel secure? Where's a relationship where you feel anxious? Where's a relationship where you feel avoidant? And where's a relationship where you feel ambivalent, which is my like oversimplification of attachment. And then I have them go through the anatomy of relationship, considering each of those relationships. So I ask questions like, what's the quality of connection in this relationship? What is the quality of the commitment in this relationship? And then how much capacity do you have? And how much capacity do you guess or has been communicated with you does the other person have? And we kind of start off there. And there's a lot of ahas from people just from that before we even get to this intimacy spectrum, which we'll probably talk about more. So, yeah, I think considering capacity and the reason that capacity is so important is it allows for humanness,
Mm.
because it doesn't mean that maybe someone doesn't have a good connection or doesn't feel committed. Maybe they just started a new job. Maybe they're new in recovery. Maybe they just lost somebody they care about to cancer and they're grieving. Maybe they just didn't sleep well last night. And so their capacity is temporarily a little bit lower that day. I know that when I don't sleep well, my capacity goes down for sure.
Mine as well. Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the beauty of the 3 C's is it allows you to in a very non-judgmental, practical way, look at, okay, what is the connection going on here? What kind of commitment is there? And what is the capacity of both parties involved?
Hmm. That I know from the capacity standpoint, like it really helped me give compassion and grace to other people. That was like probably one of the bigger takeaways that I had. I had obviously had a lot of takeaways from it. But yeah, being able to say, okay, what's my capacity? Okay, well, and how you taught the capacity for the relationship is only as strong as the lowest number.
Yes.
And so where if I'm looking at my relationships, okay, my capacity may be at a 7, but if theirs is only at a 5, well, that's as high as we're going to go. And again, like you said, bringing in the human aspect of things, well, they maybe have a lot going on right now to where they can't be as open as I can be right now. And that's
Yeah.
okay. It what it did for me was it took the blame off of myself, because I love to make it about myself and, oh wow, I'm not good enough. I didn't say the right thing. Whatever it is, I take the blame. This helped me take the blame off of myself and say, hey, they may just not be in the same place as I am, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pause for a second because
Sure.
I can tell my dog wants to go out.
No problem.
Go on, honey. Out. Okay, now she's playing a game with me. Go on. I'm in the middle of something. Either come or go. Okay. She took one look at the weather outside and went back to her bed. So
I had that same struggle with my dog this morning. So he just was like, no, it is too early. I don't want to go outside. It's cold.
yeah, she's like, just kidding. Um, so I'm so glad that you brought up the application of the capacity portion of anatomy of relationship, because I think that's worth mentioning. So yeah, when I have people do this, I have them actually rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 and rate the other. And then that is often the big aha, is when people understand that the relational capacity cannot exceed the person, place, or thing with the lower capacity. And that leads well into the next portion, which talks about the intimacy spectrum. Because if I have high capacity and I'm looking for trustworthy intimacy, and I'm going to someone with low capacity to have that intimacy, it's a setup for me to have resentment or feel abandoned, right? Because maybe if that person's capacity was at a 10, they're normally someone who could have trustworthy or even sacred intimacy with me on the spectrum. But in that moment, their capacity is at a 2. So if I go to them and they either express that their capacity is low, or I don't take the time to ask, and then I have this expectation, okay, this is where I'm going to get this connection, it's just a setup for everybody. So a lot of times when I'm in that place, maybe my inner child is really active, or I've had a frustrating day at work and I need a place to go that is trustworthy and sacred, and I've maybe tried all my tools, or I just want connection more than I want to journal or pray or meditate. I'll reach out to somebody and I'll literally say, do you have the capacity for this right now? Or maybe I don't use that word, but I'm like, hey, what's going on with you? I have something kind of heavy I want to connect with someone around, and just wondering if you're available for that. Like, just asking permission. It's also just kind, because I have no idea what somebody else has been going through that day. And, maybe 9 times out of 10, they would love to be there for me in this reciprocal way that I'm often there for them. But they just got in a fight with their husband, or their kid is being bullied at school, or they just got fired from their job, or whatever. And they don't have the space for me. And so by not checking it out with them first, their choices are self-abandonment or potentially hurt my feelings. So it's just a relational kindness to be checking out people's capacity and also considering your own. Because a lot of times what I do is I will abandon myself when my capacity is low, because I tell myself this story, well, if I'm not available for them right now when they need me, they're never going to come to me again. And then they're not going to be there for me, or whatever narrative I have around that. Or if I don't do this, I'm not going to be valued in my relationships. If I don't give of myself when my tank is empty, then I'm going to be alone. or whatever dramatic version of that I have in
Mm.
my head.
Yeah, the narratives. Well, there's so many of them that go on. We could spend a whole episode talking about narratives in our heads and how just irrational they are sometimes. So you kind of answered my next question a little bit of, can you approach somebody that, you're in a relationship with, whether it be platonic, romantic, and straight up ask them, hey, like, what is your capacity for this?
I highly recommend it actually. And if that word feels clunky or awkward to you, or you're talking to a young person or somebody that maybe wouldn't use that word, you can absolutely tailor it. Really, it's just, are you available for this right now? Just giving them a little heads up and a little preview, the same way that, like, you know, if you were at work and you needed your bosses or supervisors' attention, you wouldn't just burst in their office
Mm.
and be like, hey, help me with this thing. You would reach out and you would say, hey, I have this thing I need to work on. When would you be available to connect around this? And so a lot of times, like, when I'm teaching this, people's kind of critical feedback of me is like, well, this sounds really transactional, or I have to think about this a lot. And I'm like, yeah, yes. And like, building intimacy with people and having good relationships does require some work and
Mm.
some investment. We don't just get to like wake up in the morning and fall into good relationships. It does require some thought, it does require some effort. Relationships are not just effortless. And so any expectation that we have, that comes from, romantic comedies or, fantasy novels, right? Like, like, relationships they require communication, they require refinement. When I work with couples, one of the biggest things that I do, and if couples just did this, I would probably be out of a job, is I teach them how to have weekly meetings, the same way that you would have with your boss at work, where you come together, you have a list of things that you discuss. We won't get into all of that. And you sync up every week, because relationships, there is a business of being in a relationship. And if you take time to do those things, what you're left with is connection. What you're left with is intimacy. What you're left with is fun and spontaneity. But when you don't do those things, then you have little conflicts all day long.
Mm. I really like that. That's that's something I'm going to put in the back pocket, and hopefully one day pull that out. Um, yeah, that's. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there for a second. Sometimes when I'm really listening and really intent, I kind of just get lost in it. Um,
Yeah, you take your time. This is just a
yeah,
conversation,
yeah, that's
And I can pack a punch when I'm talking. Sometimes I say a lot in a very short period of time, and I know that.
No, I really appreciate it. I love when I have somebody on and they're just so passionate about what they're doing, and it there's absolutely times where I kind of I feel like I really have to drive the conversation, but I love when I don't have to do the driving so much and that I can just kind of sit here, because this is for me too. Like, I want to hear what you have to say for my own, and what can I apply that Erin's saying today into my own recovery in my own life. So I'm just trying to be a big sponge, and sometimes I get so full and I'm like, oh, where are we at? Okay, yeah, here we are. Um, I think too, like, asking somebody about their capacity, I think that shows some emotional awareness, and also like an invitation to for intimacy, and saying, hey, like, what is is this something that you're okay with, and it shows that you are thinking about them as well. um
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes into, I'll just map out the intimacy
yeah.
spectrum, because you use the word invitation. And, that's one of the things that I teach people is, like, moving on the spectrum of intimacy is done through boundaries and invitations. And so, just real quick for your audience, the intimacy spectrum goes from no contact, which is pretty straightforward, exactly as it sounds. No intimacy, no contact with that person. Acquaintance, quality intimacy, common ground, which is actually like a really big and fun and exciting form of intimacy that a lot of people want to skip over. but I actually find is probably my favorite form of intimacy, um, trustworthy intimacy, which is really something that gets cultivated over many experiences of people being nurturing, empathetic, present, reliable, honest. Um, and so that form of intimacy is obviously really important for people to have secure attachment. And then sacred intimacy, which is the highest quality commitment and the highest quality connection with never ending capacity. Now, if that sounds like a tall order, it is,
Mhm.
because it is not designed for most people to have with other people all the time. That type of intimacy is really designed to have with some kind of supreme, higher power, universal source, and with self, maybe with nature, maybe with a pet. And what I find is when people hear those forms of intimacy, what they don't realize is the first relationship that really is important to evaluate on that spectrum is where you are with yourself,
Mm.
or where you are with your form of divinity. Because what I find is that if people don't know how to be in sacred intimacy with self or be in trustworthy intimacy with self, they're trying to pull other people into that all the time, which is not realistic.
Mm.
It's not realistic to expect somebody, I get paid a pretty good hourly fee to be trustworthy intimacy for people. Like, so to ask other people to do that all the time with all of my skills and training and years of study is not fair. Most people can't sit in that quality of intimacy for somebody else all day long. So if somebody has that expectation of other people in their life, it's going to be a setup for potentially self harm, suicidal thinking, drugs and alcohol use, anything to numb out, because they're going to find that there's this huge void
Mm.
where they're not getting enough sacred or trustworthy intimacy in their life. So anyway, we were talking about boundaries and invitations, and when you're in relationship with others, you move up and down that spectrum through boundaries and invitations. So like if my capacity is low and somebody wants to have a trustworthy intimacy conversation with me, I have to use a boundary to let them know, like, hey, I'm not available for that. Now, you can do boundaries in a really relational way. Hey, you know what? I'm not really up for this conversation right now. You're really important to me. Could we circle back to this tomorrow afternoon? you know, or you know what, I'm going to take a bath and I'll give you a call in 20 minutes, or whatever it is, right? Letting that person know. It can also be a boundary with the desire to like distance yourself from that person and say, I really think you would do well if you got a therapist, somebody that you could talk to about this, because you're consistently coming to me with this and I just don't have the bandwidth
Mm.
to be there for you in this way. Right.
Yeah.
And that might be hurtful to somebody,
Mm.
but it's also honest.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an example of boundaries. And then invitations are the opposite, right? So maybe I'm getting to know a new friend and I say to them, hey, I've really enjoyed getting to know you. I'm going out to dinner with a couple of my best friends. I've told them all about you. I would love for you to join because they've been looking forward to meeting you. So that's an example of I'm inviting someone in for deeper intimacy. And there's lots of context clues that I'm doing that, right? It could be as simple as like, hey, I know we've only gone on 2 or 3 dates, but I'm really starting to have, deep feelings for you. And could we have a conversation about, commitment? Like, where do you think you are in this relationship? Obviously, that's an invitation. But it could also just be really, really subtle and casual. Like maybe you've seen someone at a coffee shop a few times and you're like, hey, let's grab lunch. Invitation, right? So I don't know how we got here, but I feel like I'm done talking. So I'll just pass it back
no,
to you.
no, that's great because I want to go back and touch on the scale, because I know and how it related to me, and what I definitely saw when I learned about this was I know that when I was very first into recovery, I wanted to put people in the wrong bubble. And I think that a lot of people can relate to that. I would want to put people all the way up to the trustworthy. Oh, early on in recovery, finding out that my core need is to be heard, And if you asked me, if I'm at work and you asked me how my day was going, you might get a whole lot of, you might get more than the normal. Yeah, I'm okay. Nah, I'm not, if someone who is willing to listen to me, I would just, bleh. And at the end of that conversation, if they listen to me, I would then essentially kind of move them into that trustworthy bubble, and then something would happen. And I actually have examples of this, and then they would do something, show, they would be human and show that, oh, maybe they didn't have the capacity for that, and then that would hurt. Then I would get hurt. And then want to avoid and distance myself from them. And then I'm thinking, wow, I thought they were, I thought they could be there for me. And wow, they really can't. And now, obviously, further into recovery, I am a little bit more guarded when it comes to those types of situations. But again, and I try to place people in the right ones, because I guess, not realizing, again, going back to that whole idea of like relationships take work. And if you don't have that example growing up, I did not have that example growing up, that if things were going bad in the relationship, well, then we're not married. It's time to cut ties, because this just isn't working. And it's not, subconsciously, that's what I was saying, but I wasn't saying anything on the outside. So yeah, putting people in the wrong boxes or wrong bubbles was definitely something that I really struggled with a whole lot.
Well, if you're open to it, I'm going to turn this into a little coaching moment.
Let's do it.
Because what you're saying happens so often. And even when I teach, if you notice, I call it an intimacy spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
I don't call it an intimacy bubble system.
Gotcha.
Or an intimacy categorizing system. So where I'm going with this is, when I first learned something similar to this, it was in my last coaching company, and they called it circle boundaries. And they would have you label people in these different boundary categories, kind of like what you just described. And I'm like, that's not real life. That's not how it works, which is when I brought in the 3 C's and I changed it to being an intimacy spectrum. And let me explain what I mean. So do you know what a scatter plot is? This is my scientist brain coming out. But like you have, like, let's say it's a scatter plot of like the temperature in March in Nashville over 20 years.
Okay.
You have a bunch of dots on a temperature scale, and it's like, here's the average temperature because most of the dots are there, right? Mm-hmm. So now imagine the intimacy spectrum that I just described, mm-hmm. that goes from no contact to sacred. And what I want you to think about is that your relationships, every interaction puts a dot on that scatter plot.
Okay.
Right. And so it's not so much like, oh, this person is now in my trustworthy bubble. It's, oh, I had an experience that is a dot on the spectrum in the trustworthy section of the spectrum. It might have even been closer to common ground, but I was kind of taste testing. Like, is this person capable of having a trustworthy conversation? Maybe an hour later, we have like a bunch of common ground conversations. So they get a couple dots on common ground, right? And then you kind of step back and you assess, okay, in general, most of my conversations with this person are in common ground. I've taste tested the trustworthy and they seem capable of that. So I'm going to start giving them little relational invitations and start shifting the scatter plot towards trustworthy intimacy, because people do not fit into these fixed categories. And that's where we get into relational conflict. Like, okay, my partner can have sacred intimacy with me. That's why maybe we got married. Like, whenever we're having, when we're making love and we're having this beautiful experience, it's sacred intimacy, right? Or my mom just died and my partner is sitting with me, holding my hand while I'm crying and screaming how I'm angry at God. Like, that could be a sacred intimacy moment. And also, okay, he walks in the door and he's just had a horrible day at work and his capacity is low, and we have an acquaintance interaction because he's letting me know, like, hey, I got to go take a shower. I got to go just lay down. I can't have a conversation tonight. and I'm wanting him to fit into my sacred bubble because we made this commitment, right? That's a setup.
Mm.
And so it's really important that we not think of people as these fixed things. Like, okay, just because someone has the capacity at times to have this form of intimacy does not give me the right to demand that from
Mm.
them all the time. Right. And same the other way. Like, just because I'm available for trustworthy or sacred intimacy for someone, I have the right in any moment to veto that and say, you know what, I'm not available for that right now. I love and care about you deeply. I can be available for that at another time. So that would be my first big thing to say about what you mentioned is and just so you know, what you mentioned is what, even though I teach this to my clients, and even though I know this, I forget it all the
Mm.
time. And I want people to be in a bubble because then I don't have to think about it, and then I can just move on with my day. But that's just not real life, and that's not my experience.
Yeah, I really appreciate you breaking that down a little bit more for me. That makes a lot of sense, and I totally see how, with my way of thinking, like I totally, yeah, I basically I pick a whole person up and put them there instead of taking the little bits and again on the scatter plot. So yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's really good to think about. Again, going in the back pocket, gonna definitely think a little bit more about that throughout my day and my interactions as well. And while I was taking this workshop, I was actually involved in a little bit of a sticky situation with somebody that I had. She had shown interest in me, I had shown interest in her, and honestly, like what I learned from this, and this is more capacity and boundaries involved, of how it got to a point where it was hurting me. It was hurting me, and my boundaries were not great. I mean, I'm an addict. I'm not real great at boundaries. Boundaries scare me. Even to this day, I'm better with them. But I always thought people with boundaries, oh, they're just being an asshole. When really, that's not it at all. And when it was taught that boundaries create intimacy with self, in
Mhm.
this situation, I was really able to see it for what it was, and that, yeah, putting up a boundary with this person was keeping myself safe. And
Mhm.
how, oh, wow, okay, this is creating intimacy with myself. I get to be honest with myself. Hey, this hurts. I probably shouldn't be engaging in this. This person is not, all these different experiences that we had. This person was not someone that could consistently stay the spectrum. Again, back to the spectrum, I was putting them way up higher on the spectrum, and realizing that, like, oh, I need to create some boundaries around this, and probably need to slide down a little bit on the spectrum. And so that was definitely my experience. So yeah, boundaries create intimacy with self, and I think that is just such a great way to view boundaries.
Absolutely. When I teach attachment and I teach all of this stuff, what I say to people is we only have a finite amount of energy in an hour, in a 24-hour cycle, in a week, in a month, in a year, in a life, right? And so if you think about when we are in connection with someone and we're offering intimacy to someone, that is a certain amount of an energy exchange. Like, go back to inner radiant authentic energy. Like, we're all energy, right? And connection, commitment, capacity, intimacy, those are all forms of relational currency. So to simplify it, like if I'm giving you, $50 of my intimacy, that, okay, we're actually not going to do that example. But if
Yeah.
I'm giving you 50 units, we'll say units, I'm giving you 50 units of my intimacy. And then I realize, wow, my capacity is low. I'm only available for, 10 units of intimacy. I'm gifting myself with that little bit that's left, right? And again, when I do this, people are like, man, you're making relationships sound transactional. And I'm like, well, I mean, we live in a time space continuum. It is transactional on some level,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, and in addition to, if it's not just about capacity, if it's actually about like this relationship is harming me, then yes, having a boundary can be the greatest act of self love. Because what you're saying is like this container of self and maintaining this and taking good care of this is more important than what somebody else's needs and wants are, or what somebody else's demands of me are. And that is definitely not taught to women, but also not taught to men.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that like, oh, we just have to give of ourselves in order to have good relationships. I kind of disagree with that. I wholeheartedly
Yeah.
disagree with that. I think that the better we take care of ourselves, the more sacred intimacy we have with ourselves, the more we draw in and attract relationships that are aligned with that authentic self. And then the exchange in relationship becomes easy. It does become on some level effortless. Sometimes I forget how hard it is to have a boundary because most of my relationships are relatively
Yeah.
easy today. So when I get into a sticky situation, I'm like, oh God, now I have to apply what I teach people because I've just bumped up against a situation where I need to have a boundary.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And once we start to live our boundaries, it's not so heavy and it's not so hard. So if anyone's listening and they're like, oh man, holding boundaries is so hard. What I have learned is you just live the boundaries. You don't have to like say anything anymore. And people say to me all the time, oh my gosh, you have such good boundaries. And I'm like, yeah, you didn't meet me 10 years ago. Like I used to have horrible boundaries and I can still have horrible boundaries today. But when it becomes a way of living, when it becomes a practice, you don't have to really try and you actually don't really have to say very much. You just are the boundary.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that anybody, I know early on in recovery, a lot of this stuff seemed like, oh, this is going to be so much work. There's every day I'm going to have to wake up and I'm going to have to do this, this, and this. Whereas if you continually do it, you eventually, like you said, you just live it to
Mm-hmm.
where the work, it doesn't feel like work anymore. It's more or less,
Mm-hmm.
it's the lifestyle that I want to live. And it becomes easier. And totally right. We're human. At the end of the day, we're human beings. We're not robots. My sponsor has to remind me of this all the time. Yeah, Alex, you're not a robot, even though sometimes I wish I was. Um, we're human beings, and there's the human side of us. We forget these things.
Yeah.
Especially people in recovery. I've heard this talked about. I had a guy that I met one time that this is also a disease of forgetfulness because of how
Mm-hmm.
much you can forget. I mean, and you add recovery, and then you add in life. I mean, things get kind of lost in translation sometimes.
Oh, 100%. I had a friend say to me years ago, we were actually in like a Buddhist Sangha group or something together. And he said, if you gave me the quickest path to my daughter's school where there was no traffic, it was like the secret little passage on how to get to her school every day. And it was like 10 minutes shorter. He was like, I would never forget that. I would get up every morning and I would take that path every morning. But you give me the secret to life, I'll forget it in 2 hours. And so, yeah, when it comes to spiritual, emotional truth and growth, we do have a big forgetter.
Absolutely.
And when it's practiced and it becomes a part of the essence of who we are, because I do believe that, everybody has the inner ray inside of
Mm-hmm.
them. Everybody already has that. Our work is to peel back the layers that are preventing that from shining. So as you peel back the layers, a lot of this stuff does get easier. And it's not so much about forgetting, it's about remembering who you
Mm.
are and keeping that in the forefront. And when you learn how to connect with that and remember who you truly are before you started piling on all of the armor, all of the dysfunctional ways of coping, then it's less about like remembering these things and more about living from that place and not putting the armor back on.
Remembering who you are. I like that a lot more than forgetting. Because sometimes forgetting, depending on where you're at in that day, forgetting can kind of turn into a little bit of shame. And then
Yeah.
addiction's all about the shame cycle and getting caught up in that. And so remembering who you are. I like
Mm-hmm.
that a lot. That's a really good. I always look for different ways of saying things. Like I used to call myself stupid a lot. Now I just say, oh, you're just silly. You're silly. You're being silly. Just
I'm so glad you stopped calling yourself stupid.
I, you realize I realize how hard I am on myself, and
Mm-hmm.
that nobody. I say this all the time. Like nobody is ever this hard on myself. Even in childhood, I don't think anybody was this hard on me, and I would never be this hard on somebody else either. So
Mm-hmm.
why do that to myself?
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to tear me down, and I don't need that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And yeah, that is definitely a tool that I use with clients all the time is I'll say to them, would you ever talk to, ex friend that way? Or if they have a child or a niece or a nephew, I'm like, would you ever speak to, those children that way? And they're like, well, no, of course. I'm like, so why would you speak to yourself that way? Because, I do believe that inside all of us is an inner
Mm.
child, an inner adolescent. There's even an adult that's trying to, like, use the ego to get ahead. And then there's the higher self. And then when all of those come together and they're in harmony, that's that authentic self who is living from that inner ray. So yeah, be careful how you speak to
Yeah,
yourself.
absolutely. And you brought up a really good point there with the inner child, and then also the inner adolescent and the adult. The three chairs essentially. And I don't. I'm sure you've heard the Adult Chair podcast with.
Yeah, I actually know Michelle because she
Oh,
used to live in Nashville.
that's
Hmm.
awesome. My
Yeah.
therapist told me about that. And that was like the first time that I knew that there was the inner child and I knew that there was the adult, but I had been missing like the adolescent piece.
Oh, yeah.
And when
I feel like all addicts need to know about the adolescent, the inner adolescent.
absolutely, and how it applies, and how when the little, when this is the way that I see it, is when my inner child gets triggered and is feeling some kind of hurt, that adolescent then steps in and says, "Hey, man, I see that you're hurting and I want to take care of you. I know where to
Yeah.
go to get that." And for me, that turns to porn, sex. And it's my job as the adult to then step in and say, "Hey, I got us. Come with me. I got you guys. I'm here for you. You're safe. You're loved. I see you. I hear you." So adding in that second chair there in the middle was super. It was really helpful for me, and it's a great podcast.
It's a great, yeah, no, her concepts are amazing. I kind of take a similar but more expanded approach that I've found, and it could be just because of my own journey. So I've got my inner child, which, that's the part of me that gets like terrified. It needs nurturing. It's also the part of me that can be really creative, really sweet, really loving, really playful. My inner adolescent is, I mean, she's like a bar fighter. she's she's an athlete. She can dress you down and you can feel a ton of shame if she comes out and lashes out. But my adult self, and this is where I'm a little different from Michelle in my approach, my adult self is not always, it is the healthiest survival self.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is my adult self wants to do recovery perfect. My adult self wants you to think that I never think about relapsing. My adult self wants to work those extra 2 hours. My adult self wants like self care to be a formula. My adult self wants to like buy that car I can't afford, right? And then there's like the higher self, which is also a separate part that is like the wise self, the objective self, the one that can look at things from 30,000 feet. And a lot of people want to cultivate that self and live from that. But my belief is if you imagine like a car, you've got the child in the back and probably in the car seat. You've got the teenager in the back, probably wanting to like change the radio or, mess with the settings in the car. The higher self is like the GPS,
Mm.
right? And then the adult self is in the passenger seat, and who's really driving and taking that car out into the world is the authentic self. So it's like the integrated self, knowing that we have all of these parts. Because what I have found is if people don't separate the adult self, that's often actually where people are still struggling today, right? Because they'll talk about the inner child, they'll talk about the inner teen, but when you really get people to look at the adult self, that's the part that is still kind of preventing them from breaking free into the life that they really want, because they're like, well, I don't really want to rock the boat too much. Do I really need to have a boundary? Do I really need to go on that date? I'm kind of happy being alone, right? Do I really need to like quit my job and start this company? I'm okay just getting a paycheck, which I'm not saying that you should do that, but I'm just, these are like my own
Sure.
versions of this, right? And then the higher self, people get all like, oh, I'm going to go do ayahuasca and have this, beautiful experience, or I'm going to like meditate for 2 hours every day, or every time I have an interaction with someone, I'm going to be really objective and just like stand and like look at this from this wise, objective perspective. Beautiful, wonderful. We all need to cultivate higher states of consciousness. But the inner child and the inner teen and even the adult, they all have wise things to
Hmm.
contribute. So if you're always in that higher self, you're missing things. So I believe that the integrated, authentic self has to consider all of those parts. And so when I do parts work, that's usually how I do it with people.
I really like your take on that, because I know that definitely for me, my adult self kind of gets lost in, because I think that I'm the adult. I have to be the adult. Let me look out for the younger parts of me. But there's some things that my adult self really related to in some of the things that you were saying. So that's gives me some things to think about and incorporate and look at and pray about. So I really appreciate that perspective. That was, yeah, I'm missing that adult self.
Yeah. Yeah. And listen, the adult self is like also cool.
Yeah.
The adult self probably wanted you to start the
So
podcast. I
yeah.
mean, I like the adult self, I don't want to throw shade
Hmm.
on. I just think it's good to like understand. For me, my adult self is the workaholic, you know, and that was a part of my recovery that I wasn't really wanting to look at. And so it really, at the end of the day, I knew that I had an inner child that needed to be nurtured and rescued. I knew that I had an inner teen that, quite frankly, should not be allowed out, without supervision, because she is feisty, and she's the addict, right? But that adult self, she's the one that wants things to be perfect. She's the one that would rather not go on that date because then things might get messy. She's the one that's going to hold on to her corporate job longer than she needs to, because God forbid she take a leap of faith and believe in herself. So I just find that most people that are over really 25 that I coach, it's really important to look at that adult self, because people can get stuck there because things are okay. If the adult self is running the show, nobody's dying, nobody's going bankrupt, nobody's doing anything destructive typically, but you may not be reaching that true radiant authentic energy, like radiating and living in all the ways that your life could be expansive. So yeah, that's my little plug for you, is examining that
I,
part,
I
or any of your
I
listeners.
really appreciate that, because selfishly, yeah, I'm definitely going to examine that, and I hope that other people listening do too. So thank you so much for, yeah, thank you so much for that. I know that we're getting close to the kind of the time that we talked about. One last question, and then I'm going to have you plug where people can find your work and what you guys are doing. What would you say for somebody single to find empowerment through being single? So for instance, like I was talking, this is just recently came up with my sponsor, and I'm like, all right, I'm single. I had somebody reach out to me recently that, hey, next time you're in town, let's get coffee. And I told my sponsor, hey, I don't really think that this person's my person, but you know what? I'm single, so I'm going to go do it anyway. And then it was kind of challenging me to say, okay, well, that sounds like the singleness is driving the interaction and has the power, instead of, you know what? I'm single. I don't really think that this person's it for me, so I'm okay not doing that.
Mhm. Well, I think it's multifaceted, because for some people going on that date would be empowerment. right? Even if they didn't think that that person was going to be right for them. Because for some people, they may be struggling with taking risk, or they may be struggling with meeting and making new connection and cultivating new friendships, right? And being okay if someone of the opposite sex that you could be attracted to might just be a friendship, right? I know for me, because I've been single for a while now, and I had a really interesting smart guy ask me out. And I was pretty sure there was a non-negotiable floating around in there that was going to make this guy not a good fit for me. But I went on 2 or 3 dates with him because it was good for me from an empowered place to have boundaries on a date. You know, to be going out with him and getting to know him and be attracted to him and even express that. And then also be like, and this isn't right for me. So for me, in that example, that was being single and being empowered. Now, for somebody else, it might be you've worked on a dating plan. This person is clearly not a good fit and might activate you or send you into a spiral or create a lot of negative self-talk and self-loathing. So it would be more empowering to just politely decline. So I think for each different person, it's different. It depends on where they are in their journey. A lot of my clients who struggle with being single, you know, I'll pull out the intimacy spectrum and I'll say, where are you with yourself today on the spectrum? And so if they're thinking about like the example you gave, I would say, well, have you been consistently in sacred and trustworthy intimacy with yourself? And if you are, then what's wrong with going on that coffee date? But if you're struggling with being in that with yourself and you're going on that date to fill a void or because you think there's something wrong with being single, then maybe get curious about that and really examine it. So I love empowering people to spend a lot of time single because I think there's a lot of things in our culture that tells us something is wrong if you're single. And I think getting really comfortable and secure with yourself so that when you do start dating, because to be honest, like I'm an expert at this. I teach people this all day long and I get anxious when I go on dates and I get avoidant when things are uncomfortable and I get really ambivalent when I'm not sure. You know, this stuff still comes up for me and I cultivate secure, sacred intimacy with myself every single day, multiple times a day. So I trust that even if my anxious attachment energy comes up on a date, I trust that I'm going to come back to that sacred intimacy with self. So that's what it means to date from a secure place. It's not that I don't get anxious or that I don't get uncomfortable or don't like be like, oh, this is awful. I never want to do this again. Right. But it's that I know I will return to that self. I will return to my practices, you know, because I've remembered who I am. And it's bigger than the forgetting, going back and bringing it all full circle. So did that answer your question?
Absolutely. It did. And it was, again, a great perspective. And again, going inward to see where we are with ourself. And that kind of helps determine what our next move should be. And I think that's the work. That's the work that needs to be done.
Yeah. And I said, never trust somebody who has a single answer for everything. But I feel like that is kind of my single answer for everything. It's like, go inward, monitor, see where you're at, you know, get your own support and then make decisions from that place.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Erin, where can people find the great work that you're doing?
So you can find Inner Ray at innerray.com. That's INNERRAE.com. We're also on Instagram at Inner Ray. We have a podcast called the Inner Ray Podcast, which is on both Spotify and Apple Music. We also, I think I put it on YouTube when I remember. It's on our website. I've got the courses on the website as well. And, you know, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is Erin, ERIN, at innerray.com. We would love to hear from you. And if you have any more questions about this, I have a lot of episodes that kind of go a little bit deeper into each of these topics. I am taking a brief hiatus from the podcast because I had the retreat a couple weeks ago and just holiday energy and all of that. So we'll be starting back up in the new year, and maybe we'll have you as a
I,
guest on the podcast.
I would love to. Yeah, absolutely. That would be a lot of fun. Absolutely. Yeah, I'd really like that.
Yeah, this has been so fun. I haven't been on a lot of other podcasts since I've started NRA, so I appreciate you reaching out, and um, I hope that this conversation is beneficial to all of your listeners.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. When I came across you guys on Instagram, obviously I had on Eric, who used to be a coach for you guys, and he was the one that taught the workshop. When I had him on, and he said he was no longer with you, and then I came across you guys on Instagram, I was like, oh, I have to ask. The answer is always no unless you ask. So I had to ask, and I just thank you so much for coming on and just sharing with us and breaking things down a little bit more. Great reminders for myself, and really good introduction to what you all are doing over there at NRA, and just the awesome work that you're doing. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I definitely want to have you back on in the future, and because again, a lot of this stuff we could spend another hour, 2 hours talking about. So again, Erin, thank you so much for coming on. I'm definitely going to put all of the information that you just gave us will be in the description, for everybody to go check you guys out. I think everybody should check you guys out. It's love what you all are doing. Thank you so much, Erin. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can't wait to come back.
Absolutely.